Perhaps you're aware that this is the yahrzeit of the Arizal. Obviously, on the day of the yahrzeit of a tzaddik, there is a lot of his spiritual influence that comes into the world that theoretically we are able to access, just like Lag BaOmer is said to be the yahrzeit of Rav Shimon Bar Yochai, and that's a day of simcha because that is when a lot of his Torah gets revealed. Now, whether Lag BaOmer is the yahrzeit of Rav Shimon Bar Yochai is actually a question, but the 5th of Av is the yahrzeit of the Arizal, that is for sure. So this for sure is even more firmly established than Lag BaOmer itself. As you know, the Ari is Rav Yitzchak Luria. So the Aleph Reish Yud is Adonenu, our master, Rabbeinu Yitzchak, but Ari also means the Holy Lion. It's called Arizal, Zichrono Livracha, Ari HaKadosh, whatever it would be. And as you know, he's buried in the old cemetery in Tzfat, in the same Beis HaKvaros as Rav Yosef Karo, Rav Moshe Cordovero, Rav Shlomo Alkabetz, many other very great tzaddikim. And the most amazing thing is that the Arizal died at the age of 38. He did not even reach the level of 40. And his whole teaching career of Kabbalah was only 2 years, meaning he came to Eretz Israel at 36, taught for 2 years. He died in a magefa, he died in a plague. And again, there's all sorts of mysterious reasons that the world was not ready for all of his revelations and the like. Again, to talk about the Arizal would be basically impossible, but I just want to mention that the Vilna Gaon himself said that as we approach Mashiach, the Geula will come when Klal Yisrael begins to be Isaac in the Pnimius HaTorah, the inner dimension of Torah, Kabbalah, and the like. So obviously we're not on the Madrega to be full-time Mekubalim. For that you have to master Shas and Poskim and be 40 years old and be married, all of those different things. But at least to be connected in some way to these inyanim of Pnimius HaTorah is actually a fairly good thing. Many people do it through Chasidus. Chasidus actually, in a sense, popularizes Kabbalah or makes Kabbalistic teachings more accessible. And I know in the yeshiva world today, there is actually a great yearning and great connection for Hasidus. Many people are connecting to it in various ways. But it's a funny thing that the Vilna Gaon himself, the arch Misnagate, is the one that emphasized the importance of Pnimius HaTorah as we approach the inyan of Mashiach. It's precisely because we're in such a great state of darkness that we need a greater light to bring us out of that darkness. And therefore, B'dafka, the exposure to Pnimius HaTorah, might become more necessary now than it may have been in earlier generations that were spiritually stronger. So think about the Arizal, try to connect to him in some way, and hopefully we can get a lot of chizuk in this time of Golus, the time of Chorban, the time of remembering the loss of the Beis HaMikdash, by connecting to the memories of the great tzaddikim. Okay. Now, the other thing I wanted to talk about was, since this is our last year before the end of this month, and yesterday we finished Shiras Devora in the book of Shoftim, and I went on to a digression simply because Vatiyabev Aim Sisra, Sisra's mother, crying is the makor of the minhag of Mea Kolo, so I started talking about the evolution of the Shofar. So I just want to continue that. So in a sense, you can look at this as a hachana for Elul and Yomim Noraim. Yesterday, we spoke about the fact that we obviously blow shofar in 2 places, and actually 3 places. We blow shofar before Musaf, after Kriyas HaTorah, and that is called the Tekiyos de Miyushav, the sitting down Tekiyos, because it's not connected to Shmona Esrei. And then we have the blowing of the shofar in Musaf, most minhagim only in Chazaras Hashatz, some even in the Tefillah Balachash, and that is called Tekiyos de Mi'umad. Those are the standing Tekiyos. And as far as the Gemara is concerned, those were the only 2 Tekiyos you had, Miyushav and Mu'umad, Later, once we had the minhag of 100 kolos, we had to have an extra shofar blowing in order to get us up to 100, and those are the tekios after Musaf. Some of them are in the middle of Kaddish, and some of them are at the end of Kaddish. Okay? So I just wanted to clarify one particular thing. Historically, the tekios of Musaf were actually earlier. They were enacted by Chazal before you had tekios de Miyoshev. Meaning, in the time of the Mishnah, the only shofar blowing you had was the shofar blowing during Musaf, after Malchios, after Zichronos, after Shofros, because essentially the Chachamim were killing two birds with one stone. On one hand, there's a mitzvah d'oraisa of hearing shofar. On the other hand, the Chachamim created a mitzvah d'Rabbanan of connecting it to the tefillos, bringing our tefillos up to God. So the original plan was you did not have miyushav at all. You only had mu'umad because you're killing two birds with one stone, meaning by blowing after Malchios, Zichronos, and Shofros, you're doing two things at once. You're fulfilling the mitzvah d'oraisa of shofar, and you are also fulfilling the mitzvah d'Rabbanan of tefillah. So I'm not sure if that point was made yesterday, but originally all you had were the tekios de mu'umad, and again, 100 kolos was not relevant to anything, and originally it was, in some places it was one tekiah, Shvorim Trua Tekiah after Malchios, one after Zichronos, one after Shofros, and then with the takana of Rabbi Avo, it became you had to incorporate each type. One Tashrat, one Tashat, one Tarat after Malchios, one Tashrat, one Tashat, one Tarat after Zichronos, etc. In other words, you bring in Rabbi Avo vis-a-vis the expansion of the Tekios in Musaf. So Tekios de Miyushav was actually added later for people who were not able to stay for Musaf and the like, so they should at least have a chance to fulfill the mitzvah of Shofar. Okay? So I just wanted to clarify historically, because I think maybe the way it came out was an opposite. You might have gotten the impression that first we had Miyushav and then we added Mu'umad. In point of fact, it's really the opposite. First there was Mu'umad and then they added Miyushav. Now, this raises a very interesting question, and that is, at a time when you only had the tekios during Musaf, and you literally did not have shofar blowing before Musaf, when and how did the Baal Tokeya make the bracha, Asher Kiddishanu b'mitzvosav v'tzivanu lishmoa kol shofar? We make the bracha, of course, before the first shofar blowings, and that covers all the shofar blowings. But if in the time of the Mishnah, you only blew during Chazaras Hashatz, because that was the minhag in the time of the Mishnah, so when was there a bracha? So one possibility is that the bracha was made in the middle of Chazaras Hashatz, meaning after the Chazan finished Malchios, let's say, Melech al kol haaretz mekadesh Yisrael v'yom hazikaron. And this is going to be the first shofar blowing in Musaf. The Baal Tokeya would make the bracha, Asher Kiddishanu b'mitzvah zon lishmo kol shofar. We don't do that now because we have the Miyushav, so we make the bracha earlier. But if you didn't have the Miyushav, you would make the bracha in the middle of Chazaras Hashatz. But the Ba'al HaMaor, Rav Zrachi Halevi, actually says a very fascinating, interesting yesod, and he says, when you only had the tekios of Musaf, there was no bracha on shofar blowing at all. And he lays down a very interesting klal. He says we have a general klal, which is not connected to this even, that we never make a bracha on a mitzvah that we do via a bracha. I mean, let's take a very simple example, benching. There's a mitzvah min HaTorah to bench when you eat bread. V'yachalta, v'savata, uveirachta. It's a mitzvah in the Torah. D'oraisa, it's only when you're totally full. Midrabanan, even a kazayas. So why don't I say before I bench, Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu b'mitzvaysav v'tzivanu levarech birkas hamazon. You make a bracha before tzitzis, you make a bracha before tefillin, you make a bracha before Ner Chanukah, you make a bracha before Megillah. Why don't you make a bracha before birkas hamazon? Why don't you make a bracha before Kiddush? It's mitzvah to make Kiddush, to say, Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvaysav v'tzivanu liskor es yom haShabbos. So the Ba'al HaMaor lays down a rule, Ein omrim bracha al bracha. When the mitzvah itself involves the recitation of brachos, you don't make a birkas ha-mitzvah on a mitzvah that is done by a bracha, because, so to speak, the bracha of the mitzvah itself will also count as the bracha on the mitzvah. Ein omrim bracha al bracha. So that is the klal. The Ba'al HaMaor extends the klal a little bit by saying that when the shofar was blown as the culmination of Malchios, or when the shofar was blown as the culmination of Zichronos, the shofar was blown as the culmination of Shofros, the shofar blowing becomes incorporated within the bracha. So we then have the rule of Ein Omrim Bracha Al Bracha. So this is an extension of this, because obviously shofar is not a bracha, but if you're doing it in the Musaf, it becomes part of the bracha. Now, now you might say, well, all of this is theoretical, because Lamaisa we make the bracha on the Tekiyos Dimiyushav. Actually, it's not theoretical, because the Ba'al HaMaor draws a very fascinating conclusion here. The Riff brings down the practice that we follow today, that the bracha that's made on the shofar blowings is covering all of the shofar blowings, including the miyushav, the ma'umad, and even after Kaddish to get mea kolos. And that's why you are warned upon penalty of death not to talk until the last shofar blowing. The Ba'al HaMaor, we don't paskin like the Ba'al HaMaor. The Ba'al HaMaor says that's actually a mistake. He says there is nothing wrong with being mafsik between the miyushav and the mu'umad, because the bracha of the miyushav does not have to go on the mu'umad, because the mu'umad doesn't need a bracha, because ein omrim bracha al bracha. So this is not just a theoretical statement. The Ba'al HaMaor says he's cholek on the Riff, and he says there is no issur to be mafsik. Maybe I shouldn't tell you this because we want you to be quiet. All of us should be quiet, and that's the halacha. But according to the Ba'al HaMaor, there is actually no issur of being mafsik, other than, of course, the general issur of not talking during chazaras hashatz. That you wouldn't do. But if, for example, between miyushav and Musaf, you would be allowed to talk. Now we do not paskin like the Ba'al HaMaor, but this is based on his idea that the kiyos de mu'umad does not require a bracha, because ein oimrim bracha al bracha. Yeah.
Going back, the Ramban made his kana at the time after they were talking to also blow the shofar before Musaf, the public statement.
Yeah, so that actually is a good question. Meaning we don't know b'diuk when the miyushav came in. Now the Ba'al HaMaor absolutely says beferish that this was after Rabbi Avo's takana. So he clearly puts the tekiyos de miyushav later, but from the Gemara itself and from other Rishonim, you don't really have a clear raya. So we don't know exactly how to coordinate Rabbi Avo's takana with the miyushav in terms of which came first and the like. In fact, the Ba'al HaMaor actually says a bigger for this. The Ba'al HaMaor actually says tekiyos de miyushav is post Gemara. He says the Gemara didn't even have it. Okay, that's a little schwer, but that's the Ba'al HaMaor's big chiddush. By the way, just to give you a little bit about who the Ba'al HaMaor was, if you look, you know where you could find him, right? On the Riff, which is in the back of Gemaras, The Riff summarized the sugyas of Gemaras and gives you the halacha l'maisa. And the Riff is extremely important. The Riff is the foundation of the Rambam, which in turn is the foundation of the Shulchan Aruch. And the Riff was considered to be the Gadol Hador. The Ramban, for example, who is the generation after the Riff, refers to the Riff with great reverence. He calls him Rabbeinu Hagadol. And the Riff knew his madrega. You know, it's interesting. The Ohr in Rosh Hashanah says, when Rosh Hashanah falls out on Shabbos, you don't blow shofar, right? But it says, in a place where there's a beis din, you could, because they'll warn people not to carry. And some Rishonim understand that any beis din of the Gadol Hador can blow shofar on Shabbos. It is recorded that in the Riff's beis din in Morocco, Fez, Al-Fasi means from Fez, that's where the Riff was from, they blew shofar on Shabbos in the Riff's beis din. So the Riff himself considered himself to be, again, the Gadol Hador, I mean, which he was. Now, the Ba'al HaMaor, there are many commentaries on the Riff, the Ran, the Mukhe Yosef, etc. There's also a commentary called Rashi al Riff. You see something called Rashi? So I just want to point out, again, just a bit of general knowledge for you, that Rashi, although Rashi did live after the Riff, Rashi did not write a commentary on the Riff. The commentary of Rashi on the Riff is simply somebody, anonymously, was malakate from Rashi's commentary on the Gemara, on those parts of the Gemara that the Riff brings. So there is no Rashi ala Riff directly, but on the other hand, the Ran, the Mukhe Yosef, they wrote on the Riff. But at the bottom of the page, you will see on almost every page something called Sefer HaMaor and Milchamos Hashem. Two different commentaries. Sefer HaMaor is in, just because of the printing, block letters. Milchamos Hashem is in Rashi script. As you get older, it's hard to read the Maor and the Milchamos because the print tends to be very small. Sefer HaMaor was written by Rav Zerachi Halevi, called the Ba'al HaMaor, and these are his criticisms of the Riff. Just like the Ravid critiques the Rambam, the Ba'al HaMaor critiques the Riff and says the Riff is wrong here, and the Riff is wrong here, and the Riff is wrong here. The Riff was the Gadol Hador, the undisputed Gadol Hador. The Ba'al HaMaor was 17 years old when he wrote the Sefer HaMaor. So he got a lot of flack for this. Like, who is this 17-year-old who dares attack the Gadol Hador? The Ramban wrote the Wars of Hashem to defend the Riff against the attacks of the Ba'al HaMaor. Of course, when the Ramban wrote it, the Riff was not alive, but the Ramban, so the Ramban considered that to be a holy duty, a war of Hashem to slug up the Ba'al HaMaor, right? So that's how it was. Now, what's interesting is that the Ba'al HaMaor was a tremendous, tremendous gain, and even to this very day, one who is Isaac in learning Sugyas Be'in works very hard to understand the different machloks, the machloks between Ramban and Ba'al HaMaor. There's Rashi and Tosfos, then the Ramban and Ba'al HaMaor, and that's a big, big, big mitzvah of what you might call advanced Talmudic learning. And the way people describe the process, and it is true, is when you learn the Ba'al HaMaor, you are 100% convinced that he's correct. And then when you learn the Ramban, who slugs up the Ba'al HaMaor, you're 100% certain that the Ramban is correct. It's one of those things in which the arguments are so powerful on every side that whichever one you're engaged in is the one that convinces you that they're correct. So it's a little different than Rashi and Tosfos, because Rashi is not actively engaged in debate. Rashi gives you pshat, and then Tosfos has his kashas. But here, Ramban and Ba'al HaMaor are actually they're debating, so to speak, and they're giving their debating points and the like. Okay. So that was the first point I just wanted to clarify. The inverse relationship, that first there was Ma'umat, and then there was Meyushav, which actually means that today we are splitting up the two different mitzvahs, meaning the following. There's a mitzvah d'oraisa to hear shofar. That doesn't have to be connected to Musaf. Hear shofar. Then there's a mitzvah d'Rabbanan that the shofar should be blown after Malchios, Zichronos, and Shofros. Originally, in the time of the Mishnah, it was two birds killing with one stone. We did both functions in one shofar blowing. But now that we have the Miyushav and the Muhammad, so the D'Oraisa mitzvah we fulfill before Musaf, and then we are fulfilling the Rabbanan mitzvah through the blowings of Musaf. Now we separated them. And again, this is apart from the minhag of 100 kolos, which came later. Now, the other thing I do want to point out, though, is the rabbinic obligation of blowing during Musaf is only b'tzibor, only in a minyan, either in the repetition or some even in the silent, but even that is only b'minyan. If you have to daven b'yechidus, you do not blow the shofar after Malchios, Zichronos, and Shofars. I mean, I remember I once saw a man, actually a very, very fine person, a chashuva person, a Holocaust survivor, who for some reason, he was indisposed, so he had to daven Musaf after the tzibor. And he actually had a shofar in his hands. And when he reached Malchios, he blew the shofar, etc. Even though he was davening b'yechidus, although he indeed was a great man in many, many ways, that's not the halacha. You do not blow shofar in a silent amida b'yechidus, even like the minhag that b'tzibor, the shofar was blown in the silent Shemona Esrei. Okay, so that was one point I wanted to clarify. The other point is I want to go back a little bit. Again, total digression, but it is relevant to the upcoming Zmanim. I want to talk a little bit about Malchios, Zichronos, and Shofros, which are the unique feature of the Rosh Hashanah Tefillas. Remember the format? Psicha, poetic opening, 10 verses about the theme, 3 Torah, 3 Kesuvim, 3 Nevi'im, 10th one is Torah, and then a Chasima, then a concluding paragraph. Malchios is about kingship. Zichronos is God remembering the good deeds of our forefathers. And Shofaros are the various verses about Shofar, both at Matan Torah and Moshiach, Tchias HaMesim, and the like. Malchios, Zichronos, v'Shofros. So there's a very, very interesting Marsha in Maseches Rosh Hashanah. Actually, it's not from the Marsha. The Marsha quotes Sefer HaIkarim. And I think we've had occasion in the past to talk about the great work of Jewish philosophy called Sefer HaIkarim. Some people pronounce it Sefer HaIkrim, but I think Sefer HaIkarim is correct. And this was written by Rav Yosef Albo in the 14th century. The Book of Fundamental Principles. It is a book of Jewish philosophy. And the primary goal of Rav Yosef Albo was to take issue with the Rambam. The Rambam enumerated 13 fundamental principles of Emunah. And if a Jew does not believe in these 13, each one of the 13 principles of Ikarei Emunah, he is an apikores, he is a kofer, and the bad news is he does not have a share in Olam Haba. And there's a whole machlokas. Does that even apply to a tinok shenishba? Right, Rav Chaim Soloveitchik said it does, because it's the admission ticket. We don't really care why you don't believe. So Rav Albo argued that the Rambam was confusing some things which are ikarim, fundamental roots, with what are called anafim, branches. And some of what the Rambam called an ikar is actually an anaf. And if one believes in the root, but does not fully accept the branch, even though they're mistaken, they are not called an apikores, and they have a share in the world to come. And Rav Albo said, there are not 13 fundamental principles of faith. There are only 3 fundamental principles of faith. Principle 1 is the existence of God who created heaven and earth. Got to believe in God. Principle 2 is there is some type of system of reward and punishment. reward for good, punishment for bad, some type of system. Because if there wouldn't be any system of reward and punishment, then, why do I have to do anything? There'll be no consequences. And the third is Hashem revealed his will through the divinity of the Torah. Torah is from God. These are the three Ikrei Emunah. Now, to understand this, let me give you some tangible examples. Let's compare the Rambam's list of 13 with Rav Albo's list of 3. Let's say a person says, I don't believe in physical resurrection of the body. I think the only thing that matters is the neshama. And when a person dies, God will reward that neshama in Olam Haba for all the good that it does. And I don't believe there has to be any particular reason why a body has to be resuscitated. So what is the status of a Jew who believes in Olam Haba but does not believe in Techiyas HaMesim? According to the Rambam, belief in physical resurrection is the 13th principle of faith. If you deny physical resurrection, you are a kafir in a fundamental principle of emunah, and you will not get Olam Haba. Rav Albo looks at it differently. Rav Albo says, Techiyas HaMesim is a branch of a more generalized principle called reward and punishment. So as long as I believe that there is a reward and punishment system, even if I mistakenly think it does not include physical resurrection, I'm making a mistake, but I'm not kofar in the ikar of schar v'yonos. Now, you have to pay very careful attention to the way I'm saying this, because you will sometimes hear people say, Rav Yosef Albo did not believe in physical resurrection. That's not true. Rav Yosef Albo believed in the very same things the Rambam believed in. The Rambam believed in Techiyas HaMesim, Rav Albo believed in Techiyas HaMesim. They're not arguing over what is right and what is wrong. It's a bit more subtle. They're arguing over how do you classify certain mistakes. Meaning, both like the Rambam and like Rav Albo, if a person denies resurrection of the dead, they are mistaken. They are wrong. But the nafkamina is, what are the consequences of that type of mistake? According to the Rambam, the consequences are the person is a kofar and he doesn't have a share in Olam Haba. According to Rav Albo, he is a mistaken person, but he is still within the community of Am Yisrael. Okay, this is very important because, again, you will often hear people say that Rav Albo denied belief in a lot of these things. There actually is not a single thing that he differs with the Rambam in terms of what do you believe, but he very much differed in terms of the consequences of the mistake. Now, let me give you another example that's even more dramatic. What if a person believes in Hashem? I believe in the God that created heaven and earth. But I believe that God, if he wants to, can assume a physical form. He can be the old man with a beard sitting on a throne. After all, there's actually a certain logic to this, right? Because the logic is Hashem is omnipotent. Hashem can do anything. Well, if Hashem can do anything, why can't he assume a human body? You're saying Hashem doesn't have a body. Well, what if he wants to have a body? So let's assume a person believes in what might be called corporality of God. That either God has a body, and the person could be misled from the language of many psukim. Talk about the hand of God, the eyes of God. Hashem is even described in prophecies as indeed an old man with a white beard. That's what it says. The expression is taken from the book of Daniel. According to the Rambam, if you believe that Hashem has a body, you are a kofar in one of the 13 principles of faith, you don't have a share in Olam Haba. According to Rav Albo, it's a mistake. He believes in God. He has a mistaken understanding of what Hashem is. A mistaken understanding of what Hashem is a mistake, but it's not the same as heresy. Now the Emes says on that Nakuda, the Ravid himself, on the Rambam, I mean the Ravid's Hasagas are always very short, but he essentially makes the same point. When the Rambam says anybody who believes Hashem has a body is a kofar and does not have a share in Olam Haba, the Ravid, in his sharp, sarcastic way, says a lot of people better than him, better than the Rambam, believed Hashem had a body because they were confused by psukim and even agaritas. So again, is the Ravid saying Hashem has a body? No. In fact, the Ravid's lashon is they were confused and misled. But he's saying you're not an apikoros. Okay, so Sefer Ikarim, which actually it's a very, very interesting book, relatively easy to read, much easier than the Moreh Nevuchim of the Rambam. But Sefer Ikarim is kind of a revolutionary book because he basically says there are not 13 Ikrei Emunah. There's only 3 Ikrei Emunah: Mitzias Hashem, Sechar V'Onesh, Torah Min Hashemayim. In fact, another example, right? So I gave you Mitzias Hashem. I gave you one example where he says if you believe Hashem has a body, you're still a maimin in the first Iker. Zechar V'Onesh. If you denied physical resurrection, you're still a maimin in the Iker of Zechar V'Onesh. And I'll give you an example of Torah Min Hashemayim. We believe there's revelation, but remember, the Rambam's understanding of Torah Min Hashemayim is every single letter of the Torah was dictated by God. That's our fundamental belief. Rav Albo says if a person believed that certain narrative details, not halachic details, may have been added later, once again, that's a mistaken belief, but that does not negate the ikar of revelation. In a way, it's kind of interesting why Rav Albo's Sefer got under the radar. I mean, if some rabbi were to write a book like the Sefer Ikarim today, there is no question that they would be called an apikoros and they would be put in cherem and the book would be banned. Somehow Rav Yosef Albo had the siyata d'shmaya that although his book is actually a very, very controversial thesis, but it kind of became makubal as a legitimate sefer that people could learn. Maybe because a lot of rabbis don't know what the book says, so maybe that's part of it. Okay, all right. Now Rav Albo makes a fascinating point, though, and he says the following. He says the Musaf of Rosh Hashanah is designed to affirm each of these 3 principles. Remember, Rosh Hashanah is the day of coronation. We coronate God. We proclaim God as king. And the process of proclaiming God as king is to affirm publicly our allegiance to the 3 fundamental principles of faith. Not the 13, but the 3. So he says, Malchios. Malchios is about acknowledging there is a God who created heaven and earth, and he therefore is our king. Zichronos. God remembers the good and evil that's done in the past. They're not just ignored or forgotten. That's an affirmation of reward and punishment. Because God remembers, meaning things are not just lost. And shofaros, most of the verses of shofaros are about the shofar of Matan Torah that recalls the revelation at Sinai. So the Sefer Ikarim says, it's kind of a proof, or at least an explanation, that the 3 fundamental principles of faith are exactly what we are proclaiming through Malchios, Zichronos, and Shofros. And this passage of the Sefer Ikarim is quoted by the Marsha in Maseches Rosh Hashanah. In other words, this got accepted, that you might call, as a mainstream understanding of this. Now, in truth, maybe I shouldn't talk about it. I mean, in truth, Rav Yosef Albo can actually be a very useful Pesach sometimes for people who are in trouble, for kids at risk or various others, because for whatever reason, they may have some difficulty with some of the Yud Gimel Ikrei Emunah, and as a result, if the only thing they're told is, you either believe all of this or you're not Bikoros and you're not Jewish anymore, it is important to at least be aware of Rav Yosef Albo's approach. Now again, I'm a little reluctant saying this because obviously the halacha seems to follow the Rambam, and we are expected to be ma'aminim in the Yud Gimel Ikrei Emunah, but at least a person could get the chizuk that if for whatever reason there's a bit of a problem, Rav Yosef Albo is a position that can help a person stay in the fold and still be regarded as a Jew in good standing. And as I say, the Maharsha himself quotes Rav Albo in terms of the explanation of the three tefillas. Okay, well, I guess that's it. This month's not over yet, but I think as far as this year is concerned, this is the last one. We do have a Q&A tonight, and much hatzlacha and everything. I don't know how many of you are going to be leaving the country or how many of you are going to be staying here, but let me just remind you of the Gemara in Chagiga, very important Gemara. The Gemara in Chagiga says that Divrei Torah are as difficult to acquire as gold and silver and are as easy to lose and break as glass. So here's the thing. You guys in the center, the center, I like to say, are like the Marines of Ohr Somayach, the Marine Corps, kind of work very hard, and you work and you struggle and you steig, the Yiddish word for working hard, and Baruch Hashem, you achieve quite a lot, and you should be very proud of the Hatzlacha, and it should be an impetus to go weiter. But on the other hand, you will be quite dismayed to discover, and I hope you don't discover this, how easy it is to lose the benefit of 6 months or 8 months or a year of Yigiyah B'Torah in a very short amount of time. Mama's, like the Gemara says, it was as hard to acquire as gold and as easy to lose as glass. You can wipe out a whole year in 2 weeks. So Bein Hazmanim is Bein Hazmanim, and you guys need vacations, and there is a room for recharging your batteries and relaxing and the like, but you have to be very, very committed to keeping up a daily amount of learning. Again, I'm not saying 10 hours a day, but even 1 hour a day. But the Chalapach is some very, very firm commitment that you never let a day go by without learning Torah, because that's the only way that all of the work that you invested in this year is going to remain. Otherwise, you're going to come back in Elul, and you'll be starting at ground zero, in spite of the fact that you had reached a certain level beforehand. So, B'Yezras Hashem, you should have a wonderful Bein Hazmanim, but also connect to the Torah, and may you come back refreshed and rejuvenated for a new year, a new Elul Zman.